The late summer sun in Portland had begun to sink lower, casting long shadows across the narrow street where Evan Calloway lived. He wasn't supposed to be looking out of his kitchen window at that hour. He had deadlines, invoices, an unsteady job waiting on him. But that evening, something kept his eyes rooted across the alley. It was her. She had only moved into the small storefront apartment a week earlier. Evan hadn't caught her name, but he'd noticed the way she carried herself. The first time, it had been her hair, dark, slightly curled, always tied up as though she couldn't be bothered with it, yet somehow it fell perfectly. The second time, it was the sound of her laugh floating faintly through the open window, a laugh that felt like an echo from a life he thought he'd long forgotten. Now, tonight, she stood framed by the glow of her lamp, arranging bottles of nail polish on a shelf in a neat rainbow. Something about the careful rhythm of her hands, deliberate yet tender, pulled at him. She touched each bottle like it mattered. Evan leaned closer to the glass, careful not to be obvious. And then it happened. Her eyes lifted, straight across, straight at him. For the briefest second he froze. Then, unmistakably, she smiled. It wasn't bold. It wasn't coy. It was softer than that, like she had already decided not to pretend she hadn't seen him watching. And in that quiet moment, Evan felt something shift inside his chest, the kind of shift that made him stand taller without realizing, made his breath catch as though the air itself had changed temperature. The next morning, Evan didn't expect to see her again. But as he walked down the cracked sidewalk toward the coffee stand, there she was. The small shop she'd opened was still unadorned, the sign not yet painted, but the glass door was propped open, letting out the scent of polish and lavender. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was lower than he imagined, not heavy, not sharp, just low enough to make him want to hear it again. He stopped. "Morning. You live across the street, don't you?" she asked, leaning on the doorway. Sunlight struck the silver bracelet on her wrist, scattering flecks of light against the glass. "I do," he admitted, "and I guess I've been noticing your place." Her smile widened, and she nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. "I'm Claire. I just opened the nail studio here, still settling in." "Evan," he said, extending a hand. When her fingers slid into his, he didn't expect the warmth that rushed through him. Her touch wasn't hesitant. It lingered just a second longer than formality required. And when she let go, something about the absence felt sharper than the contact itself. "Maybe you'll stop by sometime," Claire said, eyes bright with a daring hint. Maybe, he thought. But the truth was already written in the way his chest tightened, in the way his hand still remembered her skin. There would be no maybe. That afternoon he did stop by. The studio smelled faintly of citrus and something sweeter he couldn't name. Claire was crouched on the floor, arranging her tools. She looked up as the bell above the door jingled. "Changed your mind already?" she teased. He shrugged, pretending to glance around. "Figured I'd support a neighbor." "Support," she echoed with a grin, gesturing to the chair. "Sit. Let me practice on you." He almost laughed. His hands weren't made for manicures. They were the hands of a man who lifted crates, tightened bolts, worked until the nails were chipped and stained. But under her gaze, none of that seemed to matter. So he sat. And as she touched his hands, turning them palm up, examining them like they were worth studying, Evan felt an intimacy he hadn't anticipated. Her fingers skimmed the ridges of his knuckles, her thumb pressing gently into his palm. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was something quiet and electric. "Strong hands," she murmured. He swallowed. "You could say that." Their eyes met again, longer this time. Her fingertips lingered a second too long before she reached for a bottle of polish. "Color?" she asked playfully. He shook his head, laughing under his breath. "Surprise me." Her brows arched in delight. "Bold." As she worked, Evan watched the way her hair slipped from its tie, the way she blew it away with a soft puff of air. He watched the careful concentration on her face, the steady rise and fall of her breath. He realized he wanted to memorize it, to carry it with him the way one carries a secret. And somewhere between the strokes of polish, between the subtle grazes of her skin against his, he realized he was no longer thinking about his deadlines, or his bills, or the weight of his ordinary life. He was thinking only of Claire. That night, he stood by his window again. Across the alley, she was there, this time with a cup of tea, her silhouette cast against the blinds, and just like before, she lifted her eyes. Only this time she didn't just smile. She lifted her hand, slow and deliberate, pressing it to the glass. Without thinking, Evan mirrored her. His palm met his own window, lined perfectly with hers across the narrow divide. They stayed like that, separated by glass, bound by silence, longer than either of them meant to. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The distance felt like nothing at all, and for the first time in years, Evan felt the dangerous, undeniable beginning of something he couldn't name. The next morning, the small Montana town woke under a pale gray sky. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving behind puddles on the cracked pavement that caught reflections of neon signs. Sam walked down Main Street with his hands in his jacket pockets, feeling the damp chill bite through the denim. He hadn't planned on passing Emily's shop again so soon, but some invisible thread seemed to pull him back. The sign in the window glowed softly. Emily's Nail and Spa, a place he'd never imagined himself walking into, a place that felt too delicate, too polished for the kind of rough calluses on his palms. But the memory of her smile from yesterday, warm, unguarded, a light in the rain, wouldn't leave him. He slowed, paused, looked inside. Emily was there, crouched by the display shelf, carefully arranging tiny bottles of polish in color order, soft pinks, deep burgundies, shimmering silvers. Her hair fell in loose waves around her face, and she tucked a strand behind her ear with the kind of absent-minded grace that made Sam's chest tighten. She glanced up, caught him looking, and smiled. It wasn't the polite smile of a shopkeeper greeting a passerby. It was something smaller, gentler, as if she were glad he'd come back. Sam pushed the door open. A bell chimed overhead. The scent of lavender and something faintly sweet filled his lungs. "Morning," Emily said, standing, smoothing her apron. "Morning," Sam echoed, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked, boots still muddy, denim faded from years of work. I thought I'd stop by." Emily tilted her head, amused. "To get your nails done." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess that's not something guys around here do, huh?" "You'd be surprised," she said, walking closer. "Besides, sometimes it's not about the nails. It's about sitting down, letting someone take care of you for a change." Her words landed heavier than she meant, and for a moment Sam had no reply. He wasn't used to anyone taking care of him. Before he could think of an excuse to leave, Emily patted the chair by her work table. "Sit. Let me try something. If you hate it, you can walk out and never come back." Her tone was teasing, but her eyes held something steadier, a quiet insistence. Sam hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair. The cushion gave under his weight, too soft compared to the hardwood benches he was used to. His hands rested awkwardly on his thighs until Emily gently reached for one. That touch, it was small, her fingers sliding beneath his palm, lifting it toward her, but it was enough to jolt something deep inside him. Her skin was warm, impossibly smooth against the roughness of his own. For a heartbeat, he forgot to breathe. "Your hands," she murmured, turning them over, tracing the hardened lines of his calluses. "You work with wood?" "Construction. Carpentry sometimes," he said, voice lower than usual. "Makes sense." Her thumb brushed along the edge of his palm, almost absent-minded, as if reading his story through touch. These hands build things. He swallowed, suddenly aware of every point where her skin touched his. And yours? He asked quietly. She smiled without looking up. Mine try to make things beautiful. For a moment, the air between them thickened, charged. The tiny hum of the fluorescent light above seemed louder, the scent of lavender sharper. Neither moved, yet the world felt tilted toward that one simple connection. Her hand holding his, Emily finally reached for her tools, breaking the spell but not the warmth lingering in his chest. She worked carefully, trimming, smoothing, her touch precise yet tender. Every brush of her finger against his knuckles sent a subtle spark through him. Sam tried to steady his breathing, but each time their eyes met, hers bright, searching, almost daring him to notice, he felt unmoored. At one point, she leaned closer to examine a detail, and her hair brushed lightly against his wrist. The contact was feather-light, accidental, but it stole his composure. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still, though every instinct wanted to close the distance between them. Emily seemed to notice. A faint color rose on her cheeks, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, that same quiet smile from yesterday. When she finished, she set his hand gently back on the table, lingering a second longer than necessary before letting go. There, she said softly. Not so bad, is it? Sam looked at his nails, cleaner, neater than they'd ever been, but his gaze kept drifting back to her face. Not bad at all, he admitted, voice rough. The bell over the door rang again, breaking the moment. A customer walked in, and Emily straightened, stepping back, her professional tone returning instantly. But as Sam stood to leave, she brushed his arm with her fingertips, subtle, almost hidden. Come by again, she whispered, just for him. And as he stepped out into the pale light of morning, Sam realized something he hadn't felt in years, a pull, magnetic and undeniable, toward someone who seemed to see more in him than he allowed himself to believe. The day stretched long and gray, clouds pressing low over the town. Sam spent it at the construction site on the edge of Main Street, hammering boards into place while the wind whipped dust across his boots. Yet no matter how many tasks he crossed off, his mind kept drifting back to the quiet shop 2 blocks away. By evening, the air smelled of rain again. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, and the town dimmed beneath the storm. Most folks hurried home, lights blinking on behind drawn curtains. But Sam, restless, found his steps pulling him not toward his small rented room, but toward Emily's nail and spa. When he arrived, the shop was still open. Inside, Emily sat at the counter with a notebook spread before her, sketching absent-minded designs of flowers and patterns. A single lamp lit her face, soft and golden against the darkening street. She looked up, surprised but pleased. You again, she said, voice carrying a mix of humor and warmth. Couldn't stay away, Sam admitted, trying not to sound foolish. Before she could reply, the storm broke. A sudden crack of thunder rattled the windows, and the lights above flickered. Then, with a sigh that seemed to drain the whole block, the electricity died. The shop fell into darkness. Emily gasped softly. Oh, great! This town and its old power lines. Sam stepped forward instinctively. You okay? Yes, just give me a second. He heard her shuffle through drawers, then the scratch of a match. A flame bloomed, fragile but steady, and she lit a row of candles she kept near the counter. Soon, the shop glowed in warm pools of flickering light. Shadows stretched along the walls, and the once polished space felt different now. Intimate, secretive, like the world outside had vanished. Emily looked at him across the glow. Well, guess you're stuck here until the storm passes. Sam smirked. Could be worse places to be stuck. She laughed quietly, shaking her head, but the blush in her cheeks betrayed her. Tea, she offered. I can heat some water on the gas burner in the back. That sounds good, Sam said, his voice lower than usual. A few minutes later, they sat across from each other at her small work table, 2 mugs steaming between them. Rain hammered the roof, thunder rolled, but inside there was only candlelight and the quiet rhythm of breath and words. Emily cupped her mug with both hands, gazing into the steam. Funny, isn't it? When I opened this place, I imagined bright colors, chatter, music playing all the time. But nights like this, they feel closer to what I really wanted. Sam tilted his head. And what's that? She looked up, eyes luminous in the candlelight. A place that feels safe, warm, where people can forget the outside world, even if just for a little while. Her words settled deep in him. He thought of his rented room, bare walls, unmade bed, the smell of dust and solitude. Safe wasn't a word he'd use for it. Warm even less. You've done that, he said quietly. Emily's lips curved, soft and uncertain. Maybe, but it feels different tonight. Having someone here. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with something unnamed. Sam set his mug down, leaning forward. You always this brave, inviting strangers to stay during a storm? She arched a brow. You don't feel like a stranger. The truth in her tone caught him off guard. He studied her, the way the candlelight painted gold across her cheekbones, the loose strand of hair that brushed her lips until she tucked it back. Everything about her felt both familiar and dangerously new. Emily reached across the table, almost absent-minded, to straighten the edge of his sleeve where the fabric had frayed. Her fingers lingered a second longer than necessary. Sam's breath hitched. That single, simple touch carried the weight of all the things they hadn't said. He wanted to tell her how long it had been since anyone had touched him with such gentleness, how her laugh from earlier had stayed with him through every hammer strike today. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he let his hand turn slightly until his rough fingers brushed against hers. Emily stilled. Her eyes flicked up to his, searching. And in that silent exchange, the storm outside faded to nothing. For a moment, neither moved. Just the quiet contact of skin on skin, the pulse of something too strong to name beating between them. Then Emily drew a shaky breath, pulling her hand back slowly, as though afraid to break something fragile in the air. We should probably wait for the power to come back, she murmured. Sam nodded, though his chest ached with the absence of her touch. Yeah, probably. But neither of them looked away. The storm raged on, but inside the small shop, time had slowed to the flicker of candle flames, to the sound of 2 hearts beating louder than the thunder. And though no line had been crossed, both of them knew something had shifted, something neither could take back. The next morning, Main Street looked washed clean. Rainwater still glistened in the cracks of the pavement, and the air carried that sharp scent of freshness only a storm could bring. Sam's muscles ached from the long shift yesterday, but his mind wasn't on work. It was on candlelight, on the way Emily's fingers had brushed his sleeve, on how silence between them had felt louder than any thunder. He told himself it was foolish to linger on it. She had a life, a business, maybe even someone waiting for her. And yet, by the time his lunch break came, he found his boots carrying him back toward her little shop. The sign in the window still read, "Closed," but the door stood ajar. Inside, Emily knelt on the floor, brow furrowed as she fiddled with a loose strip of molding near the baseboards. A small toolbox sat open beside her, though half the tools looked untouched, as if she hadn't quite known where to begin. Sam leaned against the doorway. "Need a hand?" She looked up, startled, then smiled with relief. "Sam, you scared me. I didn't hear you come in. Guess I'm quieter than I thought," he said, stepping closer. He nodded toward the wall. "That giving you trouble?" Emily sighed, brushing dust from her palms. "The storm leaked water through the roof last night. A lot of little things need fixing. I was going to call someone, but..." She trailed off, almost sheepish. Sam crouched beside her, examining the warped wood. Doesn't look too bad. With the right nails and sealant, it'll hold. You sound like you know what you're doing. Worked construction most of my life. If you don't mind, I could take a look at the rest of the place. Emily hesitated only a second before nodding. I'd be grateful. I keep putting things off, but I can't afford to let the shop fall apart. So that afternoon, Sam rolled up his sleeves and set to work. He tightened a wobbly chair, replaced a few screws in the manicure table, even adjusted the stubborn door that never closed quite right. Emily hovered nearby, sometimes handing him tools, sometimes just watching. At one point, as he reached overhead to steady a shelf, his shirt slipped, exposing the faint scar that ran across his shoulder. He caught Emily's gaze lingering there before she quickly looked away. Old injury, he explained quietly, more to ease her discomfort than his. From work? From before. The way he said it left no room for questions. Emily didn't press. Instead, she offered a soft, understanding nod that made him oddly grateful. By the time the sun dipped low, the shop already looked steadier. Emily walked through the rooms with an almost childlike smile, running her hands along the sturdy tables, the tightened shelves. It's like new, she said, her voice warm. Not new, Sam corrected, brushing sawdust from his hands. Just cared for. She stilled at that, her eyes catching his. Something unspoken flickered there. A recognition, perhaps, that he wasn't just talking about wooden nails. To break the tension, Emily went to the back and returned with 2 bottles of cold tea. She handed one to him, their fingers grazing again. You didn't have to do all this, she said. I wanted to. The simplicity of his answer hung in the air. They sat outside the shop then, on the small step that faced the quiet street. The town was winding down for the night. Shopkeepers flipped signs to closed, and the last of the evening traffic hummed faintly in the distance. Emily sipped her drink slowly. You know, when I first opened this place, people told me it wouldn't last. They said I was too young, too far from home, too different. I almost believed them. And now? Sam asked. Now, every time I see someone leave here a little lighter, a little happier, I know I made the right choice. She turned to him, her voice softer. But it doesn't mean I don't get tired or lonely. The honesty in her words struck him. He took a long breath, steadying the tug in his chest. I know what you mean. They didn't speak of specifics, not about his empty room, not about the weight she carried alone. But in that quiet, each seemed to understand the other without needing to ask. As twilight deepened, Emily wrapped her arms around herself against the chill. Without thinking, Sam shrugged off his jacket and draped it across her shoulders. She blinked, startled by the gesture, then smiled faintly. You really don't have to keep rescuing me, you know. Maybe I like having something worth showing up for, he admitted before he could stop himself. Her eyes widened slightly, as if the words had slipped through a crack she wasn't ready to open, yet she didn't hand the jacket back. She only pulled it tighter, holding on to the warmth. The streetlights flickered on, painting the pavement in a pale glow. Sam knew he should stand, say goodnight, and walk away before the moment stretched too far. But he stayed side by side with her, listening to the night settle around them, and though neither reached for the other, though their hands remained in their laps, there was no denying it anymore. Some invisible thread had begun to weave itself between them, fragile, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. The following Sunday morning unfolded with a stillness that felt both inviting and treacherous. Eli had grown used to waking early, to the quiet discipline of a craftsman's life, but that day he rose not for work, not for habit, but for something else, an almost magnetic pull toward Claire. Through his bedroom window he could see the faint silhouette of her in the alley, a slim figure bending near the little railing garden box she had placed outside her boutique. She was in a loose white blouse, sleeves rolled back to the elbow, wrists bare. The blouse caught the sunlight like a sail, glowing faintly against the shadowed brick. She wasn't aware of him watching, or if she was, she played it well. Eli lingered at the window longer than he meant to. His chest carried an ache that was no longer simple admiration, but something heavier. He knew enough of longing to understand when it was outgrowing its container. Later that afternoon, Claire appeared at his workshop door. She carried no pretense of business, no order to place, no question about wood varnish or nail polish. She leaned against the frame, eyes bright, smile half-guarded. "You didn't stop by the boutique today," she said. "I was busy?" "With what?" "Mostly watching." She tilted her head. "At least you're honest." The exchange was light, but the air around them thickened with something unsaid. She stepped inside, walking past the half-carved oak pieces, her fingertips brushing along a row of chisels laid out neatly on his bench. Her touch on his tools felt oddly intimate, as though she were reading him in a language only she could interpret. "What are you making?" she asked. "A cedar chest, commissioned by the pastor's wife. She says it's for blankets, but I think it's for hiding the liquor her husband doesn't approve of." That made her laugh. Her laughter was not careless. It was the kind that leaned toward him like an unspoken pact between the two of them. As the afternoon light waned, Claire pulled something from her pocket, a tiny silver charm shaped like a snowflake. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "A snowflake?" "Yes, but not just any. My grandmother gave it to me when I was 12. She told me I was like snow, fragile, brief, always at risk of melting before anyone noticed I was there." Her voice had softened. Eli could hear the private weight she carried behind the words. "And do you believe her?" he asked. Claire stared at the charm for a moment, then looked up at him. "Sometimes, but then I meet people who make me feel less like melting, more like being seen." Eli stepped closer without meaning to. Their bodies were near enough now that the air between them seemed alive, charged with the trembling awareness of boundaries about to be crossed. He wanted to say something careful, something wise, but words deserted him. Claire extended her arm toward him. "Will you hold this?" He did. The silver snowflake was cold against his palm, and then, with a steady grace, she pushed her sleeve back and held out her bare wrist. "Draw it here," she whispered. He blinked. "What?" "You're a craftsman. Draw it here, with your pencil, your chalk, anything, just for me." Eli hesitated. His hands were large, roughened by wood and labor. Hers were slender, soft, marked by polish and care. Yet when he picked up the carpenter's pencil and gently touched its point against the tender inside of her wrist, neither of them pulled away. The world around them hushed. Each stroke he traced was simple, a line, a curve, a symmetry of 6. But the intimacy of it trembled through him like a current. He wasn't just sketching a snowflake. He was trespassing on skin that had been offered, marking a place usually hidden from the world. When he lifted the pencil, she looked at his work. A faint, imperfect snowflake bloomed there. She inhaled slowly, and her other hand rose, almost unconsciously, to brush against his chest. It lingered there longer than necessary, then drifted away. "Perfect," she murmured. Eli wanted, achingly, to take her hand, to keep it against him, to draw her close until there was no space left to pretend. But he also knew moments like these were fragile, dangerous. They could tilt into something neither of them could turn back from. Instead, he whispered, "You're not fragile, Claire. Snowflakes may melt, but you carve yourself into people, like you did me." For a long breath, she didn't answer. Her eyes shimmered with something between sorrow and relief. Then she leaned closer, her lips almost grazing his cheek. Not quite touching, but close enough for the heat of her breath to sting his skin. "I'll remember that," she said softly. And then she walked out, leaving the scent of her perfume and the ghost of her nearness hanging in his workshop. That night, Eli lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams he had built with his own hands. His chest burned with a mixture of wonder and fear. He had traced a snowflake on her wrist, but it felt like he had carved it into himself, and he knew it was only the beginning. Snow came late that winter. A hush had settled over town in the days after Claire left his workshop, but when the first storm broke, it felt almost orchestrated, as if the sky itself wanted to seal what had happened between them inside a white cocoon. Eli woke to the sound of wind rattling his shutters. He stoked the fire, pulled on his boots, and tried to lose himself in sanding cedar planks, but the rhythm of his hands could not erase the memory of her wrist beneath his touch, the warmth of her breath on his cheek. It clung to him like sap, impossible to scrub clean. That afternoon, Claire pushed open the door of his workshop again. Snow dusted her hair, flakes catching on her lashes. She looked at once wild and impossibly delicate. "You should close up early," she said. "The drifts are getting bad." He wiped his hands on a rag but made no move to leave. "And go where?" "To the warmth, to people, anywhere but here, alone." There was something in her tone that sounded less like advice and more like invitation. She stood just inside the threshold, snow melting down her coat, dripping onto the floorboards. He could smell her, wind, wool, and that faint trace of perfume he already knew too well. "Sit," he said quietly. She obeyed, slipping onto the stool near his bench. The hem of her coat brushed her calves, damp from snow. Her cheeks were flushed, whether from cold or from him he couldn't tell. "Why do you stay here, Eli?" she asked, watching the slow arc of his hands as he sanded the wood. "Because it's mine, because it listens." "And do I listen?" He paused. The question unsettled him, not because he doubted the answer, but because of how much she seemed to need it. "Yes," he said, too closely. Her lips curved, soft and dangerous. "Then maybe you should be careful what you let me hear." For a long time, silence stretched. Snow tapped against the window panes. Eli set the sandpaper aside and sat across from her. The small space between them felt like a fault line. One shift, one movement, and everything might break. Claire slid her gloves off slowly, fingers bare and pink from cold. She extended her hands toward the fire in the corner, then toward him. Without asking, she pressed them against his rough palms. The shock of it was instant, skin to skin, cold meeting warmth. His breath caught, the world narrowing to her touch. Her hands were fragile, yes, but insistent, as though testing whether he'd flinch. He didn't. "You're always warm," she whispered, voice trembling. "You're frozen," he murmured. "Then keep holding me." Eli didn't know if it was request or command, but he obeyed. His fingers closed around hers slowly, carefully, as if the weight of a lifetime of restraint rested on that one decision. Her thumbs brushed against his calluses, exploring the ridges of his work-worn skin. The air thickened. Their eyes locked, neither daring to look away. Claire leaned forward slightly, her knees brushing his. It was the barest contact, but it sent heat racing up his spine. "Eli," she breathed so faintly it barely reached him. He wanted, achingly, to pull her into his arms, to bury his face in her hair, to let go of the dam he had built inside himself. His hand tightened around hers, but he forced himself to hold back. "Claire," he said, his voice low, warning even himself. "If we cross this—" Her gaze didn't waver. "Then maybe we were meant to." And then, just as the moment tilted toward collapse, the wind howled against the shutters, a violent gust shaking the building. Claire startled, pulling back slightly, her hands slipping from his. The spell broke, leaving only the echo of what almost happened. They sat in silence, both breathing harder than they should. Claire rose first, gathering her coat around her. She gave him a look, half apology, half promise, and whispered, "Another time." And then she left, vanishing into the storm, leaving Eli staring at his empty palms as though they still carried her pulse. That night, Eli dreamed of snow melting against skin, of warmth fighting cold, of silence fracturing into something they couldn't take back. He woke with the knowledge that another time was coming, and soon. The storm had not let up for 3 days. Snow piled high against the doors of Eli's workshop, muting every sound, isolating him in a white silence that pressed heavy on his chest. He worked by lamplight, carving the curve of an oak beam, but his hands faltered. Each cut, each stroke, seemed haunted by the memory of her hands in his, cold and trembling, yet insistent. He hadn't seen Claire since she disappeared into the blizzard, yet he knew, without reason, without proof, that she would come back. The storm was only keeping her away, not her heart. On the 4th night, the door flew open with a violent gust, scattering snow across the wooden floor. And there she was, shivering, cheeks flushed crimson from the cold, hair damp and wild. "You'll catch your death coming here in this weather," Eli said, his voice harsher than he intended. Claire shut the door with effort, then leaned against it, panting softly. "I couldn't stay away." His tools clattered as he set them aside. He crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping just short of her. Snow melted down her coat in rivulets, dripping at her feet. "Why?" he asked, almost a growl. She looked up at him, eyes burning. "Because you're the only place that feels alive anymore." Her words broke something inside him. Before he could stop himself, his hands were on her shoulders, pulling her toward the fire. She stumbled with him, their steps clumsy, breath ragged. He helped her out of her coat, his fingers brushing against the wool, then her arms. Her skin burned beneath his touch, not from heat, but from something more dangerous. She stood before him in a simple sweater, damp at the sleeves, her breath fogging the air. "Claire!" He tried to warn her, tried to warn himself, but her name came out like a confession. "Don't stop," she whispered, and then the silence between them shattered. Her hands slid against his chest, trembling but desperate. He caught her wrists, holding her there, feeling her pulse thrum against his fingers. For one suspended heartbeat, they stared at each other, both knowing there was no turning back. When their bodies collided, it was with a force that felt inevitable. His arms closed around her, crushing her against him. She gasped as his warmth enveloped her, her cheek pressed hard against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of wind and wool and something undeniably her. Skin to skin, heat against cold. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside them. Claire tilted her head back, her lips inches from his. Her breath was fast, uneven. "I shouldn't," she murmured. "But you are," he answered, his thumb brushing along her jaw. The roughness of his touch made her shiver. Their lips met, not soft, not tentative, but with the urgency of everything they had tried to deny. She clutched at his shirt, pulling him closer. He pressed her back against the wall, the solid wood creaking under their weight. Their mouths moved with hunger, every breath stolen, every touch reckless. The fire roared, shadows flickering across the room. His hands framed her face, then slid down, gripping her waist, feeling the tremble of her body against his. She arched toward him, their hearts pounding in sync, skin burning through fabric. When he finally tore his lips from hers, his forehead rested against her temple, his breath ragged. "This changes everything." Claire's reply was a whisper, fierce and trembling. "Then let it." And in that moment, as the storm raged outside, they surrendered to the one raging between them. That night they did not part. The world beyond snow and fire could wait, because here, against the storm, they had crossed the line they could never return from. The fire had burned down low, its glow smoldering in the iron stove. Outside, the storm shrieked like a wounded animal, snow battering the walls. Inside, however, another storm was unfolding, quieter but no less fierce. Eli and Claire hadn't moved far from where they had first collided against the wall, their bodies still pressed close, their breathing unsteady, their faces flushed with heat that had nothing to do with the fire. Claire's voice broke the silence first, hushed, fragile. "Eli, we can't." His thumb brushed her lips, silencing her. "We already did." Her eyes shone in the dim light, torn between fear and longing. He saw her chest rise and fall quickly beneath her sweater, every breath betraying the war inside her. She wanted to resist. She wanted to give in. Both truths lived in her eyes at once. When she moved, it wasn't away. It was closer. She lifted her hands to his shoulders, fingertips pressing into the hard line of muscle as though anchoring herself. He felt her surrender in that touch, and something deep inside him broke free. He kissed her again, slower this time, drawing out every second as if afraid the night might vanish too soon. Her lips yielded, parted, welcomed. Her body melted into his, soft and trembling, yet full of a hidden strength that pulled him deeper. They stumbled toward the workbench, wood shavings scattering beneath their steps. He lifted her onto the edge, her knees brushing against his hips, her breath warm against his neck. She gasped as he held her tighter, their bodies pressed in ways that made words useless. The smell of oak, sawdust, and fire surrounded them, yet all Eli could taste, breathe, and feel was Claire. Her sweater bunched beneath his hands, the fabric sliding under his rough palms as he found her skin. Warm, electric, alive. She trembled at the contact, her fingers curling into his hair, their mouths never parted, their breaths tangling into one. When his lips left hers, they traveled along her jaw, to her neck, to the hollow beneath her ear. She tilted her head back, a low sound escaping her throat. Eli. It wasn't just his name, it was a plea. His hands mapped her, memorizing every curve, every shiver, every gasp. He pulled back once, searching her eyes. "Tell me to stop," he whispered hoarsely, but she shook her head, fierce, desperate. "Don't you dare!" The storm outside roared, but inside the world had narrowed to two souls clinging to each other, defying reason, defying the weight of what tomorrow might bring. Their skin met again and again, each touch harder, deeper, more demanding, until the fire in the stove was nothing compared to the fire between them. Time blurred. Minutes stretched into hours. The night devoured them whole, leaving no space for regret, only the raw ache of being alive in each other's arms. When dawn finally broke, pale light seeping through the frosted windows, the storm had passed. Claire lay against Eli's chest, his arm around her, their bodies tangled beneath an old wool blanket he had pulled from the shelf. Her hair spread across him like spilled ink. Her breathing was soft now, steady, almost peaceful. Eli's eyes were open, though. He stared at the rafters, listening to her heartbeat against him. The weight of what they had done settled heavy on his chest. This wasn't just a night. It was a beginning. And beginnings always came with consequences. The pale morning light cut through the cracks in the shutters, landing in silver ribbons across the workshop floor. Dust floated in the glow, swirling slowly, almost dreamlike, but for Eli, waking beneath that light felt nothing like a dream. Claire was still asleep, her head resting against his chest, her breath warm and even. The blanket he'd pulled over them was tangled around their legs, barely covering the evidence of a night neither of them could undo. Eli brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, careful not to wake her. She looked so peaceful, so unlike the storm of desire and need that had taken her hours before. He wanted to freeze time right there, to keep her close, to pretend the world outside those walls didn't exist, but the hammering guilt already began its work. A knock of wind rattled the shutters. Claire stirred, shifting against him with a soft sigh before her eyes blinked open. For a moment she seemed dazed, caught between sleep and memory. Then her gaze sharpened, and he saw it. The recognition. The weight. "Morning?" Eli whispered, voice rough, uncertain. Her lips parted, but she said nothing at first. She sat up slowly, the blanket sliding down her bare shoulder, revealing skin he'd kissed again and again only hours before. She pulled the wool higher, hiding herself, as if modesty could erase what they'd done. Her eyes finally met his, glassy and conflicted. "Eli, what have we done?" He sat up, running a hand through his hair. "Something we can't take back." Silence stretched between them. The stove had gone cold, leaving only faint embers, yet the air still carried the scent of ash, wood, and their bodies mingled together. Claire pressed her hand to her forehead. This can't happen again. You know that." Her voice trembled, betraying her lack of conviction. Eli leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, watching her. "Can't or shouldn't." Her eyes darted away, her breath quickening. Both. But when her fingers tightened on the blanket, when her shoulders shook ever so slightly, he knew the truth wasn't that simple. She stood, wrapping the blanket around herself like armor. "I need to go home, before anyone notices." The words struck him harder than he expected. Home, a husband, a life that didn't include him. "Claire." He rose to his feet, stepping closer but stopping just short of touching her. "Last night it wasn't meaningless." Her eyes softened, and for a heartbeat she almost let herself lean into him again. Almost. But then she pulled back, shaking her head. "That's exactly why it's dangerous." Eli swallowed hard. The truth sat like fire in his throat. He wanted to tell her he loved her, that he had since the day she'd first walked past his workshop with her soft smile and restless eyes. But the words caught, because love wasn't simple here, not when vows and promises hung over them like sharpened blades. Instead, he simply said, "You'll come back." She froze, her back to him. The blanket slipped slightly, revealing the curve of her shoulder. She didn't answer, didn't deny it, didn't confirm it. Then she walked to the door, gathering her clothes along the way. When she slipped out into the icy morning, Eli stood there alone, the echo of her presence still burning in his chest. Outside, the snow was already melting under a reluctant sun. The storm had passed, but inside both of them, a new storm had only just begun. The drive back felt endless. Claire's hands clutched the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The mountain road still carried patches of frost, and every curve made her stomach twist, not from the road itself, but from the storm inside her chest. By the time she reached the edge of town, dawn had fully broken. Houses stood quiet, smoke curling from chimneys, the smell of wood fire drifting through the air. Life looked so ordinary, so steady. But inside her, nothing was steady anymore. When she pulled into her driveway, she sat for a long moment with the engine off, staring at the front door. Her home, her prison, her sanctuary, all three at once. Inside, the house was warm. The heater hummed low, and the faint scent of coffee hung in the air. Her husband, Daniel, sat at the kitchen table with a mug in his hand, and the morning paper folded neatly beside him. He looked up the moment she entered, his brow furrowed. "You're home late." Claire's pulse thudded in her ears. She slipped off her coat, careful not to let her trembling fingers show. "The storm was bad. I didn't want to risk the drive last night." Daniel studied her a beat too long, then he nodded, setting his mug down. "Probably smart." His tone was even, but not warm. It had been a long time since it was warm. Claire poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands finding comfort in the ritual. The clink of the spoon against the ceramic echoed in the silence between them. "How was it at the shop?" Daniel asked, his voice casual, though his eyes lingered on her face. Her throat tightened. The shop, that was her excuse. That was the lie she'd chosen before the snow fell. She forced a nod. "Busy. I stayed late to finish the books." Daniel grunted in acknowledgement. Then he picked up the paper again, flipping it open. "You should have called. I worried." The word stung, worried. Once it might have meant something tender. Now it felt more like a habit than a truth. Claire sat across from him, sipping her coffee. The heat burned her tongue, but she welcomed it. Anything to ground herself, to keep from spiraling back into the memory of Eli's arms, his lips, his voice, whispering her name in the dark. Her eyes dropped to Daniel's hands as he turned the page. Steady, reliable, worn from years of work. Hands she knew well but hadn't felt on her skin in so long. Her own hands trembled under the table. She clasped them together to still them. Daniel finally lowered the paper. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You're quiet," Claire swallowed, her chest tightening. "Just tired?" He studied her for a moment longer, as if weighing whether to press. Then he nodded and went back to reading. Relief and disappointment washed over her at once. She had been spared his questions, and yet part of her almost wished he'd pry deeper, force her to confess, to tear open the truth she couldn't speak. Instead, the silence settled again, heavy, lingering. When Daniel rose to leave for work, he kissed the top of her head mechanically, like muscle memory. Claire sat frozen, her coffee untouched, her heart miles away, in a workshop where the air still smelled of wood and smoke, and where another man's touch had ignited her back to life. The front door shut behind her husband, and only then did she let her hand drift to her lips, remembering the hunger that had consumed her. The storm outside had cleared, but the storm inside her, it was only growing stronger. The morning light slipped through the cracks of Eli's workshop. Dust danced in the beams, settling on half-carved wood, scattered tools, and the worn floorboards that still held the faint marks of boot prints from last night. Claire's boots, her laughter, her breath. Eli sat on the edge of the workbench, elbows on his knees, staring at the door as though she might step back through it. But she wouldn't. He knew that. The silence was thick, too thick, the kind of silence that doesn't settle. It presses heavy on the chest. He rubbed his hands together, still feeling her warmth in them. It was maddening. He had touched wood and fire all his life, but her skin, it was different, alive, fragile. Like if he held her too tightly, she'd break, but if he let go, she'd vanish. And she had vanished. Eli pushed himself to his feet, pacing. His boots creaked against the boards. Every step felt restless, unmoored. He had lived so long by rhythm: wake early, work hard, eat little, sleep late, repeat. No deviations, no surprises. And then she had walked into his workshop, bringing a storm that tore through all that order. Now the rhythm was gone. His heart beat to hers, even though she wasn't here. He walked to the small window at the back of the shop. From there, he could see the snow beginning to melt, dripping off the branches in steady rhythms. Life moving forward, no matter what storms had come. But Eli, he wasn't sure how to move forward anymore. Part of him told himself it was a mistake, that what happened in the storm belonged to the storm, that it should stay locked there, unspoken, unnamed. But another part, the deeper part, refused to let it go. Eli leaned against the window frame, closing his eyes. He thought of Claire's voice, soft and breaking, when she whispered his name. He thought of the way she had looked at him, not with pity, not with distance, but with hunger. That wasn't an accident, that wasn't a mistake, that was truth. And if it was truth, then how long could he live pretending otherwise? He turned back to the workbench, grabbed a piece of cedar, and ran his knife along the grain. His hands moved without thought, shaping the wood into curves, smoothing edges. It was always how he thought best, through the blade, through the wood. But today, the carving became something else, a shape of her face, the slope of her jaw, the delicate line of her lips. By the time he stopped, hours had passed, and in his palm rested a small, unfinished figure of a woman who looked like Claire. He stared at it, his chest heavy. This wasn't just want. This wasn't just longing. This was something that would not leave him. As dusk began to fall again, Eli set the carving down and wiped his hands on a rag. His reflection caught in the darkened window, A man caught between silence and confession. The storm outside had passed, but inside him, something new had taken root, something that demanded more than silence. He didn't know what it would cost, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let that night be the end. The city lights glared through Claire's apartment window, but they didn't reach her. She sat at the edge of her bed, shoes still on, coat half off, staring at nothing. The sounds of downtown, the rumble of cars, the laughter spilling from bars, slid past her ears like wind she couldn't feel. She should have been at ease, back in her world, back where everything was structured, clean, predictable, where the storm stayed outside and never touched her skin. But that wasn't true anymore. Claire pressed her hands to her face, inhaling slowly, as if that might still the tremor inside her. But when she closed her eyes, the city vanished. She was back in that wooden shop, back in the smell of cedar and oil, back in Eli's arms. The warmth of him, the roughness of his palms on her skin, the quiet desperation in the way he held her. It was wrong to keep remembering, and yet she did. She couldn't stop. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She glanced at it, her husband's name flashing across the screen. Her throat tightened. She let it ring. The sound filled the room, sharp and invasive, but she couldn't pick it up. Not tonight. She stared at the glowing name until it faded, leaving the screen black again. A mirror. She saw herself there, hollow-eyed, hair falling loose, lips parted, as if she had run too far, too fast, and maybe she had. Claire stood, pacing the room. Every step felt unsteady, like the floor wasn't quite solid under her feet. What am I doing? She thought. She had built her life carefully, like stacking glass, piece by piece, a marriage that looked whole from the outside, a home that appeared untouched by storms, a role she played well enough that no one questioned her. But one night in a snowstorm, and suddenly everything felt fragile, breakable. Eli's name throbbed in her chest like a bruise. She moved to the mirror, gripping the frame as if it might steady her. She studied herself, her face pale, her eyes too wide. "This isn't you," she whispered. But it was, or maybe it had always been, hidden beneath the glass, waiting for someone to break through. And Eli had broken through. Her hands slid down the frame, trembling. She pressed her forehead against the glass, closing her eyes. She remembered the way his breath had caught when she touched him, the way he had said her name, as if it belonged to him in that moment. It had felt like a secret carved into her skin, and now, even here, miles away, she could still feel it. The phone buzzed again, this time a message. "Where are you? Why aren't you answering?" Her chest ached. She wanted to answer. She wanted to step back into the glass cage she had built. Pretend nothing had happened. Pretend she was still the Claire her husband knew, the Claire the world expected. But another part of her, wild, breathless, undone, didn't want to. Claire turned away from the phone, back toward the window. The city glowed outside, but she only saw the snow, the dark pines, the flicker of firelight in Eli's workshop. She pressed her palm to the glass. "I can't do this," she whispered. She didn't even know who she was speaking to, herself, her husband, or the memory of Eli that refused to let her go. Her reflection didn't answer, but inside her, something cracked, something small but dangerous. She sank onto the bed again, curling her arms around herself. Her world was breaking quietly, invisibly, and no one knew but her and Eli, because no matter how far she ran, no matter how loud the city grew around her, she carried him inside her now, and she didn't know how to put that down. The shop was quiet, too quiet. Eli sat at his workbench, staring at a plank of walnut that had been sanded down to smooth perfection. His hands rested on it, calloused and strong, but tonight they felt useless. He had built tables, chairs, cabinets, things that lasted, things that could hold weight, but he couldn't build anything to hold this. The silence, the ache, the image of Claire leaving, her face turned away so he wouldn't see the truth in her eyes. He hadn't touched his tools since. Eli leaned back in his chair, pressing his hands to his face. He had told himself it was just the storm, just two people trapped by circumstance, just the way loneliness had collided with chance. But lies never sat well with him, and this one burned, because it hadn't been just the storm, it had been her. The way she said his name like it mattered, the way she touched him as if she'd been holding herself back for years. He had tried to forget, God knows he had, but forgetting was impossible when every breath in this place still carried her scent. The phone on his workbench buzzed, a message from his sister checking in. He ignored it. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. What he wanted was the one person he couldn't have, and maybe shouldn't, but Eli had never been the kind of man to sit still when something mattered, and this, whatever lived between him and Claire, it mattered more than anything else. He stood, pacing the workshop. His boots thudded against the floorboards. She's gone. She's back in her world. Let her go, he told himself, but his chest tightened at the thought. He didn't want to let her go, not when he knew she hadn't really wanted to leave, not when he had seen the way her hands shook as she walked away. There were fractures in her world. He had felt them. He had seen the truth in her silence, and Eli couldn't pretend those cracks didn't matter. He went to the window. The night outside was cold and clear. The snow was melting now, leaving patches of brown earth exposed. The storm had passed, but the aftermath remained, much like what lived inside him. Eli's reflection stared back at him, broad shoulders, tired eyes, a face carved by work and years of holding himself steady. But tonight, steadiness felt like a lie, because deep down he knew he wasn't done with her, not by a long shot. He picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over her name. He had it memorized by now, every letter carved into him, but he didn't press call, not yet. Instead, he whispered to the silence, "Claire." The sound of it filled the shop, soft and broken. He set the phone down. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He grabbed his jacket, pulled it on, and stepped out into the night. The cold bit at his skin, but he welcomed it. It cleared his head. Eli walked toward the road, the one that led out of town, toward her world, toward the place he had never belonged. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know what he would say if he found her. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't live with silence anymore. He had to see her. Even if it broke them both. Claire hadn't been sleeping well. Nights in the city felt louder than ever. Cars rushing by, neon bleeding through her curtains, the faint hum of a world that never rested. But it wasn't the noise that kept her awake. It was the memory of quiet, the hush of falling snow against the cabin windows, the sound of Eli's voice, low and steady, saying her name as if it had been carved just for him. She pressed a hand to her chest as if she could still that ache. It had been weeks since she left. She had returned to her routine, gallery meetings, client calls, polished shoes tapping against marble floors. Everything looked as it should. On the outside, nothing had changed. But inside everything had. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that cabin, back in his arms, and she hated herself for wanting it still. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She froze. It was late. No one came by this hour, not without reason. Her pulse quickened as she crossed the room. She told herself it was nothing, maybe a neighbor, maybe a delivery at the wrong apartment, but when she opened the door, the world stilled, because it was him. Eli stood in the hallway, shoulders broad beneath his worn jacket, snow still clinging to his hair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city noise seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of her heart racing. "Claire," he said finally, his voice rough, as if he'd walked miles just to get here. She gripped the edge of the doorframe. "Eli, what are you doing here?" "I had to see you." The words were simple, bare, and yet they carried the weight of everything she had tried to bury. She wanted to close the door. She wanted to protect herself, to protect him, to hold on to the fragile order she had pieced together since leaving, but she couldn't move. Her eyes lingered on him, the way his chest rose with every breath, the way his hands flexed at his sides as if he wanted to reach for her, but didn't dare. God, she had missed him. Eli, her voice broke. You shouldn't be here. I know, he said softly, but I couldn't stay away. The silence stretched thick and trembling. Claire's hand trembled on the doorknob. She could feel the heat of him even from where he stood. The space between them felt impossibly small, yet infinite. If she let him in, everything would change. Again. If she sent him away, she knew she would shatter. Please, Eli whispered, eyes locked on hers. Don't shut me out. Her resolve crumbled. Without another word, she stepped aside, and he walked in. The door clicked shut behind them, soft but final, like the sealing of a secret. Claire leaned against it, her palms pressed flat against the wood, trying to steady herself. Eli stood only a few feet away, but the air between them pulsed as if alive, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. The city hummed outside her window, but here, in this small apartment, time narrowed to two people who had run out of reasons to pretend. Claire's voice was barely a whisper. You shouldn't have come, Eli. This... Her breath faltered. This can't happen. He took a step closer, his boots heavy on her polished floor. I told myself the same thing, he murmured, eyes locked on hers. Every day since you left, I tried to believe it. But it's a lie, Claire. We both know it. Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to build a wall of logic between them, but when he looked at her like that, raw, unguarded, needing her, her defenses shook loose. His hand lifted, slow, hesitant, until it hovered near her cheek. He didn't touch her. Not yet. He was waiting, asking without words. Claire's breath hitched. Her skin burned with the memory of his hands, the way they had once fit so easily around her waist, the way his touch had left her trembling and whole all at once. She should have stepped back. Instead, she leaned in. His thumb brushed her cheek, gentle, reverent, as though she might disappear if he pressed too hard. And then, as if a dam finally gave way, she closed the distance. Their lips met, desperate, hungry, the weeks of restraint collapsing in an instant. The kiss was rough at first, almost frantic, until it slowed, softened, deepened. She clutched his jacket, pulling him closer. He pressed her against the door, his hands framing her face as if anchoring her to this moment. Every line of his body against hers felt like fire through thin cloth. Claire broke the kiss, her forehead pressed to his, her breath shaky. This is madness, she whispered, though her arms still clung to him. Maybe, Eli breathed, but it's ours. Her laugh was choked, wet with unshed tears. She hated him for being right, and she loved him for not letting her go. He kissed her again, slower this time, like he had all the time in the world. And for once, she let herself believe it. The air inside Claire's apartment had turned heavy, almost molten. Every breath she drew felt thick with Eli's presence, with the heat that rolled off him in waves. Her hands roamed up his chest, clutching the fabric of his jacket until she pushed it back and it slid to the floor. His shirt stretched tight across his shoulders, and she remembered, too vividly, the strength that lived beneath. Eli's mouth found hers again, less frantic now, but deeper, richer, like he wanted to savor what he had almost lost forever. Claire broke away just long enough to whisper, her voice trembling but defiant. You don't get to disappear again, Eli, not after this. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her close until their bodies aligned, heat meeting heat. I couldn't even if I tried, he murmured against her skin, his lips grazing the line of her jaw. I'm already here, all of me. Her head tipped back as his mouth traveled down, the soft brush of his breath making her shiver. She pulled him by the hand toward the couch, but they never made it there. Halfway across the room, he caught her, spinning her back into his arms, his lips crashing into hers again. They stumbled against the wall, the thud echoing through the apartment. Her fingers tangled in his hair, tugging, urging, while his palms slid along the curve of her back, memorizing every inch as though afraid this was still a dream. The city lights outside painted streaks of gold across their skin. Every place they touched seemed to burn brighter. Her shoulder where his lips pressed, his wrist where her nails dug in, their hips colliding like the world couldn't keep them apart another second. The quiet apartment filled with the sounds they tried to stifle. Gasps, low murmurs, the friction of two people who had been starving for too long. Claire whispered his name like a confession, and Eli answered not with words, but with a fierce, grounding kiss. The wall behind her shook, but she didn't care. Nothing outside this moment mattered. For the first time in years, she wasn't running, wasn't hiding. She was exactly where she was meant to be, pressed against the man she could never forget. And in that fire, in that collision of past and present, they both knew the night had only just begun. The room pulsed with a fever neither of them could control. Claire's fingers trembled as they skimmed Eli's jawline, down the length of his neck, until she felt the strong rhythm of his heartbeat hammering against her touch. He wasn't calm, he was burning, same as her. "Claire!" His voice broke like he was trying to stop himself, but couldn't. Her eyes locked onto his. "Don't you dare hold back now." He surged forward, lifting her slightly so her back pressed against the wall again. Her legs wrapped around him without hesitation, their bodies fusing in ways that erased the years apart. Every movement was desperate yet tender, a balance only they could strike. She gasped against his mouth, feeling the solid press of his chest, the raw power in his arms as he held her like she was weightless. The sensation of his warmth spreading into her made her dizzy, her body aching for more of him, deeper, closer. The jacket, the shirt, the thin layers between them. One by one, they slipped away, discarded to the floor. Her skin ignited wherever his hands explored, her waist, her ribs, the curve of her hip. Every touch left trails of fire that only begged for more. Eli's lips traced along her collarbone, slow but searing until she whispered his name again, softer, almost a plea. He lifted his head, their foreheads pressed together, both of them trembling. "This isn't just tonight," Eli said, his breath ragged. "I know," Claire whispered back. Her fingers tightened against his back, pulling him closer. "It's always been you. It always will be." The words undid him. He crushed his mouth to hers, their kiss fierce, unrelenting, the kind that left them both gasping. The wall became too small for the storm between them. With a sudden urgency, Eli carried her across the room, lowering her onto the couch as though she were something precious, even while his body burned for her with reckless intensity. Claire's nails raked across his shoulders, her body arching to meet him, skin pressed against skin, nothing left to hide, no space between them. The room echoed with their need, their whispers, their surrender. Every second was a collision of longing and release, of two people rediscovering each other in the most intimate way possible. It wasn't just passion, it was memory, regret, forgiveness, and love, all tangled together in the heat of their bodies. And when their cries finally broke the silence of the apartment, they both knew. There was no turning back. The room was still humming with their heartbeat, though the frenzy had passed. Claire lay sprawled across the couch, her skin glowing in the dim lamplight, chest rising and falling as she fought to catch her breath. Eli hovered beside her, one arm wrapped beneath her, the other tracing slow, almost reverent lines along her bare shoulder. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, Words felt too fragile for what had just happened. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, as though the very air hadn't yet cooled from the fire that had burned through them. Claire finally turned her head, her lips curving in the faintest smile, though her eyes shimmered with something deeper. "I can't believe," she began, but the words faltered. "That we did this?" Eli finished for her, his voice low and hoarse. She let out a quiet laugh, brushing her fingers over his jaw. "No, that it still feels like the world makes sense when you're this close." Her honesty hit him harder than any touch, his hand stilled, resting on her collarbone, as if he was afraid she might vanish if he moved. "Claire," he whispered, "I tried to bury this for years. I told myself what we had back then was just a moment, just heat and chance. But tonight—" His throat tightened. He pressed his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling. "Tonight proved I was lying to myself. It's always been you." Her chest ached with those words, the kind of ache that carried both joy and danger, because she wanted to believe him. God, she did believe him, but she also knew the cost. Her life back in Seattle, her husband, the image of stability she had built for herself. Her fingers curled against his chest, feeling the steady thud of his heart. "You know this changes everything," she murmured. "I don't care," he said instantly, his voice fierce. "I can't let you slip through my hands again." She searched his eyes, torn between reason and the deep pull of her own heart, and as she did she realized there was no undoing what had just happened. They had crossed a threshold, and whatever came next, neither of them would walk away untouched. The night stretched on. They lay tangled together, whispering pieces of themselves they hadn't dared speak in years. Laughter mixed with quiet tears, kisses with confessions. But beneath it all, one truth kept echoing in Claire's chest. They had opened a door they could never close again. The pale glow of morning slipped through the thin curtains, spreading across the small living room. Claire blinked awake, disoriented at first, until the scent of Eli's skin and the steady rise and fall of his chest beneath her cheek reminded her of where she was and what they had done. For a few long seconds she didn't move. She let herself sink into the warmth, her fingers curled lightly into his shirt, her breath sinking with his. It felt safe, almost like a dream, the kind of dream she used to cling to as a girl lying awake at night in that old Montana house, imagining what might have been if she'd been braver, freer, but reality pressed in with the daylight. Her wedding ring caught the sun like a cruel reminder as her hand shifted against his chest. Claire froze, staring at the gold band, a rush of guilt cutting through the haze of last night's closeness. Eli stirred beneath her, his voice husky with sleep. "Morning." She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Morning," she echoed softly. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb lingering against her cheek. "You're beautiful like this. No walls, no running." The tenderness in his voice unraveled her. She wanted to stay wrapped in him, but the weight of what she was leaving behind, her husband, her life in Seattle, gnawed at her insides. "Eli," she whispered, pulling back enough to meet his eyes. "We can't just pretend there aren't consequences. Last night was—" She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. "It was everything I remembered, everything I thought I'd buried. But I have a husband, a life, and you deserve more than being someone's secret." His jaw tightened. He sat up, gently guiding her with him so they stayed close. His eyes, still heavy with sleep, locked on hers with a kind of fierce clarity. "I don't want to be a secret. I want you. All of you. I've waited too damn long to let this slip through my fingers again." Her heart pounded, torn clean down the middle. "Do you hear yourself? If I walk away from Seattle, I burn everything I've built. People will get hurt. I'll get hurt. And you—" She broke off, choking back a sob. "You'll resent me when it all falls apart." He caught her chin, forcing her to look at him. His touch was firm, but his voice was softer now, like he was afraid to push her too far. "I won't resent you. Claire, I've lived without you once. I know what that emptiness feels like. I'd rather face the mess with you than spend another lifetime wondering what could have been." She searched his face, desperate for some flaw in his conviction, some sign he was romanticizing it all. But all she found was steady, unshakable truth, and that terrified her most of all, because deep down she wanted to believe him. Her hand trembled as she pressed it to his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palm. She closed her eyes, torn between the life she knew and the one her soul was crying out for. The morning light grew stronger, spilling across them both, leaving no shadows to hide in. Claire realized then the hardest choice was no longer about desire. It was about whether she was brave enough to face the storm her heart was demanding. Claire stood by the window, the pale Montana sky stretching wide and endless beyond the glass. Her hands trembled as she tugged her coat tighter around her, though the chill that shook her wasn't from the morning air. It was from the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Eli leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her silently. His eyes carried no blame, only a steady patience that made it harder for her to breathe. He didn't move closer. He didn't beg. He just waited, letting the silence do what words couldn't. "I need to go," Claire whispered finally, her voice unsteady. The words landed between them like a stone thrown into still water. Eli's jaw flexed, but he didn't argue. He only asked, "Back to Seattle?" She nodded faintly, turning away so he wouldn't see the tears brimming in her eyes. "Back to what I promised, to what I built. It's not as simple as leaving. It never was." He exhaled, slow and heavy, then pushed himself off the counter. His boots scraped against the wooden floor as he crossed the room, stopping just short of her. "You think walking out that door will make it easier?" His voice was calm, but it carried an undercurrent of ache. "It won't, Claire. You'll drive back to your life, back to him, and you'll tell yourself it's the right thing. But every night, when it's quiet, you'll hear it. The truth. That this," he touched his chest lightly, right over his heart, "is where you belong." Her throat closed. She wanted to scream at him, tell him to stop, to let her leave without dragging her heart through the mud, but the honesty in his words cut straight through her defenses. She shook her head, pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the window. "Don't make this harder, Eli, please. You don't understand." "I do understand." His tone sharpened, not out of anger but desperation. "I've been where you are. I've stared at choices that rip a person apart, but I'm done pretending, like we're not standing in front of something real. I won't let you lie to yourself, Claire. Not about me. Not about us." Her chest tightened, and she spun to face him, her cheeks flushed with a storm of guilt and longing. "And what do you expect me to do? Just leave my husband? Walk away from years of a life we built together? Do you know how selfish that sounds?" Eli stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Sometimes love is selfish. Sometimes it asks you to break the rules, to walk through fire, to risk the life you know because the one waiting for you is worth more than all of it combined." The space between them pulsed with tension, alive and raw. His nearness made her skin ache with memory, with need, with everything she had tried to bury for years. Claire clenched her fists at her sides, fighting the pull of him. "Eli, if I stay, if I give in to this, we won't just hurt him, we'll destroy him, and I don't know if I can live with that kind of blood on my hands." For the first time, Eli's face cracked. His voice broke around the edges, low and hoarse. "Then tell me how I'm supposed to live with losing you again, because I swear, Claire, if you walk out that door this time, I don't think I'll survive it." The room went silent, heavy with words that could not be unsaid. Claire's hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Behind her, Eli stood motionless, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. In that quiet Montana house, two lives teetered on the edge of a choice neither of them was ready to make, but both knew would change everything. And the door between them became more than wood and hinges. It became the line between the life she was bound to and the life her heart begged her to choose. The tires crunched over gravel as Claire's car pulled away from Eli's driveway. The early light of Montana spilled over the horizon, painting the sky in pale blues and rose golds, but to her the colors looked muted, almost lifeless. Her hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles whitened. The rear-view mirror reflected the outline of the cabin growing smaller, and then it was gone, swallowed by the bend in the road. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog of tears clouding her vision. Inside, her chest throbbed with a hollow ache. She had done the thing she believed was right. She had chosen responsibility, vows, promises that were written in ink years ago, yet the steering wheel felt like chains in her hands, and every mile put more weight on her chest. She whispered into the emptiness, "Why does doing the right thing feel like dying?" The car answered with silence, the hum of the engine and the wind slicing past her windows, filling the void where Eli's voice should have been. Back at the cabin, Eli hadn't moved from the doorway. He stood there long after the dust of her departure had settled, his arms limp at his sides, his heart pounding like a hammer against his ribs. He had seen her leave once before, years ago, when they were younger and too afraid of what it meant to fall into something they couldn't control. But this time was different. This time he knew what he wanted, and it wasn't a half-life without her. He stepped outside, the cold air biting against his skin, and muttered to himself, "Not again, not this time." The words were both a vow and a prayer. Hours later, Claire parked in front of a quiet diner off the highway. She hadn't eaten all morning, her stomach twisted into knots. Sliding into a booth, she ordered coffee, but barely touched it. The steam curled up, fading quickly into the air, much like the warmth she had left behind in Eli's kitchen. Her phone buzzed against the table. Her husband's name lit up the screen. She stared at it, frozen. Her thumb hovered over the green button, but the memory of Eli's voice echoed in her mind. Sometimes love is selfish. Sometimes it asks you to break the rules. Claire pressed decline. The phone screen went dark. Her heart slammed against her ribs, and she pressed her palms to her eyes, whispering a shaky prayer no one else could hear. She couldn't go back to Seattle yet, not like this, not while her soul was caught between two worlds. She needed space, she needed clarity, and yet, deep down, she knew clarity would always have Eli's face. Back in Montana, Eli picked up his worn jacket from the hook by the door. He wasn't a man of grand speeches or reckless gestures, but love had stripped him of his caution. He locked the cabin door behind him, tossed his bag into the truck, and muttered into the quiet air, "If she thinks she's leaving me behind this time, she doesn't know me at all." The truck roared to life, and with it so did his resolve. The road between them stretched long and uncertain, but neither of them knew that every mile they traveled apart was pulling them closer to the collision neither could outrun. The interstate stretched before Claire like an endless ribbon, flat and gray beneath the pale Montana sun. She had been driving for hours, though she couldn't recall half the town she passed. Each gas station, each stretch of farmland, blurred together, as if the world itself refused to acknowledge her decision. Her husband's voice message sat unheard on her phone, just the small red dot pulsing on the screen, daring her to listen. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not when her chest was still burning with Eli's touch, his voice echoing through her ribs. She slowed at a crossroads, a literal one. To the right, the road curved toward the interstate. toward Seattle, toward her husband, toward the life she had promised to live. To the left, a narrow highway led deeper into Montana's quiet valleys. Her heart beat in her throat. Claire's hands trembled on the steering wheel. She should go right. Everyone would expect her to. That was the road of duty, the road of vows. But the left road shimmered in the morning light, an invitation, a whisper, a chance to breathe before she drowned in decisions she wasn't ready to make. She pulled left. Back at his cabin, Eli's truck tires bit into gravel as he sped down the mountain road. He didn't know where she'd gone, only that her car had headed east. That was enough. The air outside his window rushed cold and sharp, filling his lungs like fire, but he didn't slow. Not even when the truck rattled against the uneven ground. Every memory of Claire, her laughter under the cottonwood trees when they were teenagers, the way she said his name like it was both a plea and a warning, the warmth of her in his bed just nights ago, drove him forward. He had lost her once. He had let her slip away in the name of what was proper, what was expected. Not this time. Claire pulled into a roadside inn by late afternoon. The building leaned tiredly against the weight of decades, its sign half burnt out, but she couldn't keep driving. She checked into a small room with peeling wallpaper and a window that overlooked an empty stretch of highway. Alone at last, she collapsed onto the bed and buried her face in the thin pillow. But rest didn't come. Instead, her body still hummed with the memory of Eli's hands, her skin aching with the imprint of him. Her lips whispered his name into the empty room, and the sound broke her. Eli reached the same crossroads just as the sky began to bruise with evening light. He slowed, the weight of choice pressing down on him. His gut told him she hadn't gone back to Seattle. Not yet. She wasn't ready. He looked left. The setting sun painted that road gold, as if pointing him forward. He turned the wheel. The night settled soft and heavy over Claire's motel room. She sat by the window, watching headlights pass in the distance. Each time, her chest clenched, as if expecting to see his truck roll into view. She told herself it was impossible. He wouldn't come after her. He would let her go, like before. But deep inside, where truth lived, she prayed she was wrong. And out on the road, barreling toward her without even knowing where she was, Eli whispered into the dark, "Hold on, Claire, just hold on." The neon sign of the diner buzzed faintly against the quiet night. Claire pushed open the door and stepped inside, her sweater wrapped tight around her shoulders. The air smelled of coffee, fried onions, and something warmer, something like comfort. She slid into a booth at the far end, facing the window. From here, she could watch the empty parking lot, watch the road, watch for nothing, and no one in particular. But her chest betrayed her, rising and falling as if she were expecting him to walk in at any moment. The waitress poured her a cup of coffee without asking. Claire murmured thanks, wrapping her hands around the mug as if the heat could settle her storm. Across town, Eli's truck rumbled into the gas station. He killed the engine and stepped out, stretching his stiff muscles. He'd been driving since morning, guided by nothing but instinct and the faint hope that somehow fate hadn't scattered them too far apart. The attendant pointed him toward the only diner still open this late. "Best coffee in 50 miles, the kid said. Eli gave a tired smile, nodded, and got back into the truck. He didn't know it yet, but his headlights traced the same stretch of asphalt Claire had been staring at from her booth. Inside the diner, Claire tried to focus on her notebook. The pages were mostly blank, only a few scribbled lines where she had tried to capture her thoughts. What is right? What is mine? Why does the memory of his touch feel more like home than any house I've ever lived in? She shut the notebook quickly, as if the words themselves might betray her if anyone looked too closely. A bell above the diner door jingled. Claire's breath caught. But it wasn't him, just a group of tired truckers laughing too loudly, shaking the night off their shoulders. Claire sagged back against the booth, relief and disappointment tangled inside her. Eli drove the last mile toward the diner. His knuckles whitened on the wheel. The closer he came, the more the air around him thickened, heavy with something he couldn't name. A pull, a certainty. He parked under the buzzing neon and sat for a long moment, staring at the glowing windows. Something waited for him in there. He didn't know if it was salvation or heartbreak, maybe both. He finally opened the door and stepped inside. Claire didn't look up at first. She was tracing the rim of her coffee mug, lost in her thoughts. But then the air shifted, a familiar warmth, like a shadow brushing across her skin. Her head lifted, and there he was. Eli froze just inside the doorway, his eyes locking on hers across the diner. For a heartbeat, the noise of the truckers, the hum of the neon, even the ticking clock on the wall, everything fell away. There was only them, the two of them, after years of silence, after days of running, standing still in the same small town. The waitress barely noticed the way the world shifted when Eli walked across the diner. She only nodded toward the empty booths and said, "Sit wherever you like." But for Claire, it was as if the air thickened, every second stretching out, pulling her breath taut in her chest. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She only watched him come closer, his boots striking the tile floor in a rhythm that echoed inside her. Eli stopped at her booth. For a moment he stood there, his hand resting on the back of the seat, his jaw working as though every word he'd rehearsed had fled him. Claire's voice broke the silence first, softer than she meant. Eli. His name lingered between them like something fragile. Eli's chest tightened. "Claire," he said, the syllables heavy, rough, almost reverent. She gestured to the seat across from her, her fingers trembling just slightly. "Sit." He slid into the booth, folding his tall frame into the space, his knees nearly brushing hers under the table. The closeness was too much and not enough. For a long while, neither spoke. The waitress poured him coffee, and he murmured a distracted thanks, his eyes never leaving Claire's. She couldn't bring herself to sip her own cup. Her throat was too dry. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Eli leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely on the table. "I didn't think you wanted to." Her eyes fell, tracing the cracks in the tabletop. "I told myself that, over and over, that it was better this way." She swallowed hard. "But better doesn't mean easier." His hand inched forward, stopping just shy of hers. The unspoken question hung in the air. Claire lifted her gaze. Their eyes locked. Two storms meeting after years apart. "I don't know what we are anymore," she said, her voice trembling with truth. "I don't know what we're allowed to be." Eli's voice was low, steady, but threaded with ache. "All I know is, every mile I drove, every night I lay awake, I thought of you. That has to mean something." The weight of his words pressed against her chest until her heart stuttered. She wanted to reach for him, to bridge the space between their hands, but fear held her still. Her lips parted, barely more than a whisper. "It means everything." Outside, the neon sign flickered, casting blue and red shadows across the window. Inside, two people sat in the quiet glow of a small-town diner, their silence broken, their longing laid bare. The space between them was shrinking, and for the first time in years, it felt like they were finally breathing the same air again. The diner door swung open, letting in a rush of cold air. Claire stepped outside first, the night wind brushing against her cheeks, carrying the faint smell of pine and snow. The parking lot was dimly lit, the neon sign above the diner sputtering, casting shifting colors across the cracked pavement. Eli followed close behind. When the door shut, the hum of the world softened. Only the sound of their breaths and the far-off hum of a passing truck remained. For a moment, neither spoke. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, the chill seeping through her sweater. Eli noticed and hesitated, his hand twitching at his side as though debating whether to reach out. Finally, he stepped closer. "It's colder than I thought," he murmured. Claire let out a faint laugh, thin, brittle, but real. You'd think we'd be used to it by now." They stood there, a foot apart. The glow of the neon painting Eli's jawline in red, then blue, then red again. His eyes never left her face. He'd memorized her before, years ago, but now every detail felt new, etched sharper by time and longing. "Claire," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying something that almost shook. She looked up at him, the weight of his gaze pulling her in. "Yes, I don't want to ruin this," he admitted, his throat tight. "But if I don't at least say it, I'll regret it." Her pulse raced. "Say what?" He moved closer, so close that the space between them felt electric. His breath curled in the cold night, mingling with hers. "That I still feel it, every bit of it, like it never left." The words hit her harder than the wind. Claire's body trembled, not from the chill, but from the storm rising inside her. Her hand slipped from her own arm almost without permission, brushing lightly against his. That single touch, a graze of skin on skin, was enough to ignite everything. Eli's hand turned, catching hers. Their fingers laced slowly, deliberately, as though neither dared to rush the moment. His palm was warm against her cold skin. Claire's breath caught. She whispered, "After all these years," his grip tightened, gentle but firm, "it's still us." They stood in silence, hands joined under the flickering neon. Two shadows pulled back into the same orbit. Around them, the night stretched vast and quiet, but in that fragile closeness, the world felt unbearably small, just the two of them, and the weight of everything they hadn't stopped wanting. The diner's neon glow faded in the rearview mirror as Eli pulled his truck onto the empty road. The cab smelled faintly of pine cleaner and worn leather, a scent that wrapped itself around Claire the way old memories did. She sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window at the streaks of snow swirling across the headlights. Neither of them spoke at first. The hum of the engine filled the silence, a low, steady sound that only made her more aware of the rush in her chest. She could feel him, his presence, his warmth, just inches away. The space between them felt fragile, almost dangerous, as if one stray word or touch might break it open. Eli's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was spinning. He wanted to say something, anything, but everything felt too heavy, too big for the narrow cab of his truck. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You okay?" Claire turned toward him, her profile catching in the glow of the dashboard lights. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "It feels like I'm standing on the edge of something, and I don't know if I'm supposed to step forward or turn back." His chest ached at her words. "I feel the same." Their eyes met briefly, just long enough for the air between them to thrum like a live wire. The truck rolled to a stop in front of Claire's small hotel. The building loomed quiet and dim, only a single porch light flickering near the entrance. The engine idled, filling the silence with a steady vibration. Neither of them moved. Claire's hand rested on the door handle, but she didn't pull it. Eli's knuckles were white around the wheel, but he didn't shift the truck into park. The moment stretched long, unbearably so. Claire's breath fogged the window, her reflection a ghostly blur. At last, Eli broke the silence, his voice rough. "Claire, do you want me to walk you in?" Her heart stuttered. She should say no. She should end this before it spun further out of control. But instead, she whispered, "Yes." The word hung in the cab, heavy with meaning, impossible to take back. Eli's jaw clenched, his hand finally leaving the wheel. He cut the engine. The night fell into stillness, broken only by the sound of their breaths, quicker now, more ragged, as if both were bracing for what came next. The snow crunched softly under their boots as they stepped out of the truck. The cold bit at Claire's cheeks, but her body ran warm, buzzing as if her nerves had been lit from within. She kept her coat wrapped tightly around her, yet the heat she felt had nothing to do with fabric or fleece. It came from the man walking silently beside her. Eli didn't say a word as he fell into step with her. His long stride slowed just enough to match hers. His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets, but every few steps his arm brushed against hers. Each accidental touch sent a pulse through her, quick and insistent. The lobby doors whispered open. Warm air rolled over them, carrying the faint scent of wood polish and stale coffee. The small-town hotel was quiet, nearly empty, its tiled floor echoing their footsteps as they crossed it together. Claire felt the front desk clerk glance up briefly, but neither she nor Eli offered more than a nod. It was late, too late for questions, too late for explanations. They reached the elevator. Claire pressed the button, her finger trembling slightly. The soft ding came too quickly, as if the world itself was rushing them forward. Inside the narrow space, the silence deepened. Eli's reflection stood beside hers in the mirrored wall, tall and broad, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed ahead. She stole a glance upward, searching his face for hesitation, but all she found was the same storm she felt inside herself, restrained but fierce, waiting for release. The elevator doors opened onto the quiet hallway. Carpet muffled their steps as they walked together side by side until they stopped before her door. Claire's breath hitched, the numbers on the plaque blurred as her pulse drummed too loudly in her ears. Eli stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, close enough that the air between them grew dense. He didn't move, didn't speak. His hands flexed at his sides as though fighting some invisible weight. Claire slid her keycard slowly into the lock. The soft green light blinked, the door clicked. Still, she didn't open it. Not yet. She turned to face him, her voice barely a whisper. Eli, the single word carried every question, every fear, every want. His chest rose sharply as if he'd been holding his breath. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt on its axis, narrowing down to this hallway, this door, this impossible closeness. Her fingers brushed his knuckles, light, tentative, the gentlest spark of touch. And in that instant, the choice between stepping back or falling forward no longer felt like hers alone. The door gave way with a soft click, swinging open into the hush of her room. A low lamp by the bed cast a golden glow, spilling shadows along the walls, warm against the winter dark. Claire stepped inside first, her heart pounding so hard she thought he must hear it. She left the door ajar, half hoping Eli would turn away, half praying he wouldn't. For a breathless second he lingered in the hallway. Then his boots crossed the threshold, the door closing behind him with a sound that felt final, sealing them in together. The silence thickened. Claire set her purse down on the chair by the window, her hands trembling. She turned slowly, finding him already watching her. His face carried a gravity that stole her breath. Not lust alone, but something deeper, heavier. Restrained for too long, neither moved at first. The air between them was alive, humming with all the words they hadn't said, all the years they had carried them. Then Eli took one step closer, and another, until the space between them dissolved. Claire's hand lifted, almost against her will, brushing against the rough fabric of his jacket. The contact jolted them both, like fire racing through dry timber. His hand found hers, strong, sure, pulling it to his chest, where his heart thudded in wild rhythm. She inhaled sharply, her body trembling with a mix of fear and need. "Eli," she whispered, as though naming him could anchor her in this moment. But he didn't answer. Instead, he bent his head, slow, deliberate, searching her eyes for permission, and when her lips parted, when her breath caught in a silent yes, he closed the distance. Their mouths met with a force that surprised them both, hungry, desperate, the dam finally broken. His hands slid up her arms, steadying her, then pulling her closer until every line of their bodies aligned. She melted into him, fingers clutching his shirt as though she might drown without the hold. The kiss deepened, fierce, unrelenting. Years of longing compressed into seconds, unfolding all at once. When they broke apart, gasping, their foreheads pressed together, her tears hot against his skin. "This is wrong," she whispered, though her body arched toward him. "Then let it be wrong," he murmured, his voice raw. "I can't turn back, Claire, not tonight." Her breath shook as his hand cupped her jaw, his thumb tracing her cheek with aching tenderness. The moment wavered between surrender and restraint, and then, with a quiet, shuddering exhale, she let go. The room seemed to close in around them as their lips found each other again, harder this time, stronger, neither willing to pull away. The weight of years fell away, replaced only by the sharp, undeniable truth of touch. Tonight they had crossed a line, and there was no retreat. The lamp on the nightstand hummed faintly, its glow painting their skin in shades of amber and shadow. Claire's breath came ragged, her back pressing gently against the edge of the bed as Eli moved closer, his frame towering yet trembling with restraint. His hand slipped down her arm, slow, reverent, until their fingers interlaced again. She squeezed, as though reminding him she was here, that she wasn't pulling away, that she wanted this. When their mouths met once more, it wasn't tentative. It was a crash of years collapsing into the present, his lips hard against hers, hers opening with a soft gasp that poured fire into his chest. She tugged at his jacket, desperate, almost frantic. The fabric resisted, heavy with the cold outside, until he shrugged it off and let it fall to the floor. She touched his shirt then, feeling the warmth of his body beneath, the ridges of muscle, the rapid thud of his heart. He caught her hand, pressing it flat against him, eyes burning into hers. "You feel that?" he asked, voice low, hoarse. She nodded, words lost to the storm inside her. Then his hands were on her waist, pulling her closer, lifting her ever so slightly until her body pressed fully into his. The heat of him seared through her clothes. Every point of contact screamed with urgency. Her sweater clung to her as his hands slid beneath, fingertips tracing the soft lines of her back. She shivered, not from the cold but from the intensity of his touch. When he pulled it over her head, her hair spilled free, framing her flushed face. He paused, just for a heartbeat, drinking in the sight of her, and she, chest rising and falling, let him see. For once, she didn't hide. Their lips met again, harder this time, almost bruising. His hands gripped her, pulling her against him, no space left between them. Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling, urging, needing more. The room echoed with their breathing, quick, uneven, raw. The bed pressed into the back of her thighs, and when he lifted her onto it, the world seemed to tilt. She clung to him as he hovered above, their eyes locking, both knowing they had broken every barrier. Her whisper broke the silence. "Don't stop." And he didn't. Their bodies found a rhythm, urgent and powerful, as though they had been waiting a lifetime for this single night. Every brush of skin against skin was electric, every gasp a confession, every touch a promise neither could put into words. There was no more restraint, no more walls, just the raw, undeniable truth of what they had always carried inside them. Tonight, nothing existed beyond this room, beyond the fever of their embrace, beyond the fire that burned every inch of hesitation away. The storm outside had softened to a gentle rain, but inside Claire's room, the world still pulsed like a thunderclap. The sheets were tangled, her hair wild across the pillow, and Eli hovered above her, his body trembling, not from hesitation anymore, but from the sheer force of everything breaking free at once. She touched his face, fingers brushing the line of his jaw, steadying him even as her own chest heaved. "I've waited so long," she whispered, her voice ragged, confessional. His lips descended again, claiming hers with a hunger that left no room for air. Every kiss was deeper, harder, as though they were trying to carve their names into each other's very skin. His hands slid down, gripping her as if she might slip away. Their bodies moved together, urgent, fierce, unstoppable. The mattress groaned under their rhythm, the air thick with heat, and the sharp sound of their breaths colliding. Her nails dug into his back, leaving crescents that would last long after tonight. "Claire," his voice broke against her neck, muffled by the press of his lips. "I can't hold back any more." "Then don't," she answered, pulling him tighter. Her legs wrapped around him, anchoring him, urging him to let go. And he did. The last of his restraint shattered as he gave himself over completely. Every thrust, every shiver, every gasp tore through the walls they'd built for years. Her cries filled the room, not of pain, but of release, of recognition, of the aching joy of finally being seen. Their passion reached its peak in a wave that left them both undone, bodies quaking, hearts pounding against one another. For a moment, the world ceased to exist. Just heat, just fire, just two souls colliding in the dark. When the storm inside them finally ebbed, he collapsed beside her, chest heaving, arm instinctively pulling her against him. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive, carrying everything they had just surrendered to. Claire rested her head on his shoulder, eyes closed, lips still trembling. "We can't go back," she murmured. Eli kissed the top of her hair, his voice low, certain. "I don't want to." Outside, the rain slowed, leaving only the steady drip from the roof. Inside, their breathing steadied too. Though the fire between them hadn't dimmed, it had only settled deeper, a promise neither dared to speak, yet both understood. Because tonight there were no more barriers, no more secrets, just the raw, unshakable truth of a love they had finally unleashed.